I used to think that home was a place where I was safe, where I could relax without anyone watching. That sense of security was something I took for granted, until I found out it was all a lie. It started small. I'd be sitting on my couch, reading or watching TV, when I'd get this strange feeling, like a prickling at the back of my neck. You know the feeling, right? That sense you get when someone's watching you. I'd look around, try to brush it off, blame it on city life, but the feeling didn't go away. It only grew. I'd catch these weird flickers in my peripheral vision. Once I could have sworn I saw a red light blink behind the bookshelf, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I was probably just tired, letting my mind play the tricks on me. Living in a city can mess with your head like that. But as the weeks went by, things got stranger. One night, it was well past midnight, I heard a low buzzing. It sounded like something electrical. I got up, checking every corner, every socket, even the old alarm clock I kept by my bed. But I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. Frustrated and unsettled, I tried to go back to sleep, though I hardly managed to rest. The worst part was that I wasn't alone in the apartment. My roommate, Jake, had been living with me for the past year. We weren't exactly best friends, but he was easy to get along with, a guy who mostly kept to himself. And that was fine by me. I never would have guessed that he could be the cause of what was about to unfold. A few days after that sleepless night, I came home to find Jake sitting in the living room, his laptop open in front of him. He barely looked up when I came in, which was normal, so I didn't think much of it. But as I passed by, I noticed something odd, a reflection in his screen. It looked like a live feed. At first I thought he was watching some sort of video, but then I froze. The room on his screen wasn't just any room. It was my bedroom. Heart pounding. I stepped back, and Jake must have heard my breathing or felt me staring, because he slammed his laptop shut and looked up, his face expressionless. I tried to say something, but my voice wouldn't come. My mouth went dry, and my thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. My bedroom? Why would he have a feed of my bedroom? Jake mumbled something about needing to get some air, and before I could react, he slipped past me and out the door. The moment he was gone, I rushed to his laptop, hands shaking as I fumbled to open it. I knew it was locked, but I had to see. I had to know what he was hiding. Of course, it was password protected. My hands clenched, mind racing, wondering what I was going to do. But my gaze drifted toward the bookshelf, the same shelf where I'd noticed that strange red light flickering in the corner of my eye. I stepped closer, and there, hidden among a few old novels, was a small camera, barely noticeable. But there it was, pointed straight at my bed. I felt sick, like a cold wave of nausea had hit me. How many more cameras were there? With every shaky breath, I searched the apartment. I tore apart the corners, checking the kitchen, the living room, and every possible hiding place. They were everywhere. In the smoke detector, in the vents, even in the bathroom. My entire apartment had been wired, turned into a surveillance network, without me ever realizing it. And Jake, who I thought was a decent, trustworthy guy, had been the one watching me, recording me. My skin crawled just thinking about it. When he returned that evening, I was ready to confront him. My heart was hammering, but I knew I couldn't back down. I demanded he tell me what he'd been doing, why he'd been spying on me. His face, usually so passive, twisted with something dark, something cold. He denied it, of course, pretended he had no idea what I was talking about, but I could see the lie in his eyes. I could feel it, like a poison seeping into my skin. My anger burned away the fear, and I pressed him harder, showing him the cameras I'd found, the evidence of his betrayal. At first he tried to laugh it off, saying they weren't his, that maybe someone else had placed them. But the more I challenged him, the more his mask started to slip. He went from denial to anger, shouting at me to just drop it. That was when I saw it, the flash of something in his eyes, a twisted satisfaction, like he'd enjoyed every second of watching me without my knowledge. And I knew in that moment that he'd never stop unless I stopped him. I called the police. They came, and they took Jake away. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after all the cameras were removed. I'd sit on the couch, and it would come back, that creeping feeling, that invisible gaze pressing down on me. My own home had turned into a prison, a place where every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every quiet moment felt like a threat. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even relax. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving scars that wouldn't heal. I moved out a few months later, hoping that a new place would help me feel normal again. But the memories followed me. Trusting people, letting someone close. It all felt impossible. Now, whenever I'm in my home, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, just to be sure I'm really alone. Because once you've been watched, once you've had that privacy stolen from you, there's no going back. There's only the constant reminder that anyone can wear a friendly face, hide behind a smile, and turn your life into a nightmare. When I first moved in with Brian, he seemed like the perfect roommate. Easygoing, laid back, he was always up for a laugh, and we quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm. It felt like a fresh start, just what I needed after my breakup. New city, new life. I'd barely thought about the inevitable unknowns, the stuff you don't know until you're in it. I'd lucked out with Brian, right? But little things started to happen. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I'd catch Brian staring just a second or two too long, his face blank, eyes just empty. He'd snap out of it, flash a smile, and everything would be back to normal. But those moments stuck with me, resurfacing in the quiet hours, twisting in my head like a splinter I couldn't pull out. Then there were the late-night phone calls. I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, and I'd hear his voice through the walls, hushed and intense, like he didn't want me to hear. But I couldn't help it. Fragments of words seeped through, loose ends, no witnesses, not yet. His voice had this edge to it, a dangerous energy that chilled me to the bone. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he had secrets, but who doesn't? One night, I heard him talking louder than usual. It was past 3 in the morning, and curiosity got the best of me. I crept out of bed, tiptoeing closer to his door. His voice was low and urgent. Then he said something that froze me in my tracks. He has no idea who he's dealing with. I didn't sleep that night. But in the daylight, the shadows of the night faded, and my fears seemed ridiculous. I decided to ignore it, chalk it up to late-night paranoia. But then came the discovery that shattered every illusion I had about Brian. I was cleaning one Saturday morning when I noticed his closet door was slightly open. Curiosity, and maybe some leftover suspicion, pushed me to take a peek. There, in the back, was an unmarked box, like something you'd stash away and forget. I knew I shouldn't, but something told me I needed to know what was inside. The first thing I saw was a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. They were old, some going back more than a decade, and each one described a brutal, unsolved murder. As I read each headline, a wave of dread washed over me, more suffocating with each line. The stories were vicious, the details disturbingly specific. I shuffled through the clippings, my hands shaking. Then I saw the knives. There was a line of switchblades, polished and glinting even in the dim light, each one carefully maintained, laid out like a grotesque display. They weren't just for show. These were blades that had seen use, tools kept sharp and clean, waiting. And that wasn't all. Beneath the knives was a leather wallet, worn but well kept. I opened it and found a driver's license with Brian's face staring back at me. Except it wasn't Brian's name on the card. It was a name I'd never seen before. A chill crept down my spine as I stared at the ID. It was Brian, without a doubt. But this was someone else. Someone with a whole life I knew nothing about. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My stomach twisted, and I slammed the box shut, backing out of the closet, heart pounding. How long had I been living with a complete stranger? I knew I had to leave. I grabbed a bag and threw in as many clothes as I could, fumbling with zippers, my mind a blur. I had to get out before he realized I knew. But as I turned to go, the sound of the front door opening paralyzed me. I looked up, heart hammering. Brian stood in the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine, his face unreadable. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm, but his eyes, I saw something in them I'd never seen before, a quiet, calculating coldness. Nothing. I just wanted to spend a night out. Haven't done that in a while, I stammered, forcing a shaky smile. But I could tell he didn't buy it. He stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back. He looked at my half-packed bag, and something shifted in his expression, his easygoing facade melting into something darker, sharper. The days that followed were torture. Brian's behavior shifted in ways I can't fully describe. He became clingy, possessive even, as though he knew I was trying to pull away. Every time I thought I had a moment alone, he was there, watching. His gaze lingered, tracking me like prey. I felt trapped, cornered in a house that once felt like a home, but was now a prison. Then came the night that pushed me over the edge. I woke in the dark, a sound piercing the silence, a slow, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from Brian's room, the sound repetitive and chilling. I felt a dread that tightened around me like a vice. My heart pounded as I crept toward his door, reaching out with a hand that trembled so violently I barely managed to keep my grip steady. I pushed the door open just a crack, just enough to see him. Brian was hunched over his desk, bathed in the eerie glow of his computer screen. Spread out in front of him were maps, photos, clippings, but at the center of it all was something that made my blood run cold. A picture of me, circled in thick red marker, with notes scribbled in the margins, plans, observations, instructions. He was plotting something that involved me, and I had no intention of finding out what. I barely remember leaving the house that night. I was too numb to feel anything, too paralyzed by fear to think straight. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty streets, my only goal to put as much distance as possible between me and that house, between me and him. I went straight to the police. I poured out my story in one breathless rush, my voice shaking with terror. They didn't laugh. They took me seriously, which was somehow more frightening than if they hadn't. In the days that followed, I learned more about my roommate. Brian wasn't his real name. He'd had several names, several lives, each tied to places where people had disappeared or been found dead. He was a ghost, hiding in plain sight, a predator who wore a mask of normalcy. I moved as far as I could, changed my own name, did everything in my power to become invisible. Even now, years later, I look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Living with him was a nightmare. Escaping him became my obsession. But even now I wonder if he's out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to pick up where he left off. Some nightmares. They don't end when you wake up. It started out so small, barely a flicker on my radar. At first, Alex was just off. Strange, sure, but nothing I couldn't brush aside. A missed call here, a forgotten grocery trip there. Maybe it was stress. After all, we'd both been struggling with work and classes. So when I noticed his room getting messier, clothes piling up on the floor, and trash lingering on his desk, I didn't think much of it. But then, it got worse, much worse. One night I came home to find him staring blankly at the wall, like he was seeing something I couldn't. He didn't even turn to look at me when I called his name. His lips moved silently, muttering phrases I couldn't understand. I laughed it off awkwardly, made some joke about him losing it, and retreated to my room. But my mind couldn't shake the feeling. I lay in bed, unable to sleep. Alex's vacant stare replaying over and over in my head. Things only escalated from there. He began disappearing at odd hours, slipping out in the dead of night without a word. The next morning he'd look exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, sometimes a faint tremor in his hands. And then there were the whispers. At first I thought I was imagining things, soft, low murmurs coming from his room. But one night, as I lay awake, I could hear him through the wall, mumbling frantically, as if he was talking to someone. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe he'd started seeing someone, or was talking to a friend late at night. But then he stopped acknowledging me altogether, even in the daylight. He'd move through the apartment like a ghost, his footsteps unnervingly light. I'd catch him staring at the walls, his head tilted, as though he could hear something I couldn't. One time I saw him sitting in the dark, eyes wide open, fixed on the corner of the room. His face was devoid of any emotion, like a mask. But the turning point came one night when I got home late. The apartment was completely dark, and as I fumbled for the light switch, I stumbled over something in the hallway. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. Alex's belongings were strewn everywhere. Books, clothes, even some of my things had been tossed around. It looked like he'd gone on some frenzied rampage. But there was more. Symbols, strange, twisted symbols, had been scrawled all over the walls. Some of them looked like they were done in marker, but there were streaks of red that seemed darker, more sinister. I stood there, stunned, my pulse pounding in my ears. Suddenly I heard a soft, haunting hum coming from his room. My mouth went dry. I crept down the hall, my heart hammering as I neared his door. I could barely breathe, each step feeling like I was crossing a line I wouldn't be able to come back from. I reached his door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, summoning all the courage I had, I pushed it open. Alex was sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by a ring of flickering candles. Shadows danced across his face, twisted and grotesque. He sat perfectly still, eyes locked on something that seemed to hang in the air before him. His face was pale, almost ghastly, and a wide, eerie grin was stretched across his lips. My eyes dropped, and I saw what he was holding, a large kitchen knife, clutched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Alex," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't move, didn't even blink, but then his eyes darted up to meet mine. There was something in them, a wild gleam that sent chills racing down my spine. He stared at me, unblinking, and then he started to laugh, a low, hollow chuckle that grew louder and more frenzied with each passing second. "They're coming," he whispered. "They're coming for us, and we're not ready." His voice was trembling, thick with fear. "But you're part of it, aren't you?" A cold wave of terror crashed over me. I backed up slowly, my eyes never leaving the knife in his hand. "I don't know what you're talking about, man," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Let's just talk about this, okay?" He laughed again, harsher this time. "Talk? You think they'll let us talk our way out of this?" He gestured wildly at the walls, his knife leaving a glint in the candlelight. "They're everywhere, watching, waiting. And you think this is just some game?" I took a step back, heart pounding. I needed to get out of there, to get away from this madness. But as I turned to leave, he lunged forward, his movements sudden and jerky, like a puppet on strings. "You can't leave," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't run. They won't let you." I bolted, stumbling out of the room and slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, hear his voice, shrill and desperate, echoing through the hallway. They're coming for you too." I sprinted down the stairs and out into the night, my mind a haze of fear and disbelief. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, my legs burning, my lungs heaving. I stood there gasping for air and looked back at the distant silhouette of our apartment building. The lights were still off, the place looking like some ominous silent shadow. That night, I slept in my car, unable to shake the image of Alex's wide, vacant eyes. By morning, I was back, police by my side, hoping to end this nightmare. But when we entered the apartment, Alex was gone. His room was empty, the candles snuffed out, and the strange symbols wiped clean. All that remained was an eerie silence, a hollow emptiness that settled like dust on every surface. I never saw him again after that. I moved out, left town, but I still hear his whispers at night, still see his face in my nightmares, that wild, unblinking gaze seared into my memory. Sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, clutching his knife, whispering his warning, and even now, I can still hear his voice, echoing through the quiet. They're coming for you too."